I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. Joseph Smith has been here before. He's brought a state to the edge of an all-out civil war before. He's been charged with treason and conspiracy to murder before. He's been in jail before. He's undergone a court-martial which sentenced him to death before. He resisted the will of state militias commanded by states' governors before. He's riled up his followers into a frenzy befitting a revolution before. He's been arrested for being a criminal kingpin before, after surrendering to prevent a total war. Everything that happened in Nauvoo happened before in Missouri, but the scale was far larger and the stakes far higher. After Jo had repeatedly defied an arrest warrant for over 2 weeks' time, he and his 17 co-conspirators who caused the expositor printing press to be destroyed were finally in the city of Carthage, surrendering to the Illinois state legal system. They arrived the night of June 24th, 5 minutes before midnight, to a crowd of howling anti-Mormons who consider this surrender the first battle victory in a larger impending Illinois Mormon war. The people in Carthage at this time considered Joseph Smith and his criminal friends to be the greatest enemies to the peace and tranquility of their lives. Before the Mormons started arriving in 1839, everything was just peachy. Then thousands of refugees streamed into the state from Missouri to take advantage of Illinois hospitality, or some people say Illinois hospitality. I don't know which way is right. And since their arrival, things haven't been the same. The Mormons were terrible neighbors. They having rager parties late into the night, and finally the neighbors got the cops to shut down the party. Now, the initial charges which landed Jo, Hyrum, and their 16 city councilmen in state custody were simply inciting riot from the destruction of the expositor. There would be other charges worked out by the state prosecutor in the coming trial, including destruction of property, abuse of power, First Amendment violations, and so forth, but the charge of riot for now would at least get them in jail and before Judge Morrison. Now, Judge Morrison had sworn out the first arrest warrant the day after the expositor was destroyed. That was June 11th. And that was based on charges that were filed by Francis M. Higbee because they, quote, commit a riot wherein they, with force and violence, broke into the printing office and unlawfully and with force burned and destroyed the printing press, type, and fixtures of the same, end quote. When Constable Bettesworth from Carthage arrested Joseph Smith with that warrant, Jo held his sham trials in Nauvoo, chaired by Daniel H. Wells, and Jo was discharged of all of the alleged crimes. The Nauvoo court refused to hear testimony of those who suffered the crime. It produced witnesses who said whatever Jo needed them to say. It came to the conclusion that it started with, before the hearing was even called, that Joseph Smith couldn't possibly have committed a crime in destroying a rival religion's newspaper. Governor Ford in all of this was no idiot, and he considered the Nauvoo municipal court hearings to be a farce, rightfully so, thereby considering the original arrest warrant that was issued by Judge Morrison and served by Constable Bettesworth still unserved. As Jo's posse of 18 guilty men descended into Carthage with a small armed escort, Constable Bettesworth presented Judge Morrison's original arrest warrant to the men and, quote, the prisoners voluntarily surrendered themselves to the constable, end quote. Now, voluntarily there from the history of the church is such a loaded term because after everything we've discussed for the past 7 episodes, that has been a series of events calculated by Joseph Smith to never surrender voluntarily. Only when the specter of total war and another Mormon extermination became inevitable did Jo finally wave the white flag here. In many ways, it wouldn't be crazy to think that his continued flaunting of the law after the expositor was destroyed made the central issues and the anti-Mormon outrage exponentially worse. If he had just surrendered to the first arrest warrant, the governor wouldn't be handling this issue personally. The state militias never would have been called out. Jo, he would have fought through the legal system, and he probably would have been able to appeal the issue to the state Supreme Court after this hypothetical Carthage hearing would have convicted him. But he'd still be alive, and the Mormon settlement wouldn't be under the threat of state militias marching into the city and burning Mormon homes to the ground. My point? Jo didn't voluntarily surrender. He was forced to surrender, just like every other surrender that he had done. He'd done everything in his power to resist arrest, including declaring martial law. But, of course, no officer pinned him to the ground until he died in this case, right? Governor Thomas Ford was doing his best to handle this issue personally. He didn't really have many options available to him. He knew a court hearing in Carthage would cause a riot one way or another based on the outcome. If Jo was guilty, the Mormons might very well march the Nauvoo Legion, their own militia, into Carthage to break him out and lay the city to waste. And the forces that Governor Ford had at his command were not powerful enough to resist that onslaught. If Joseph Smith was discharged, the anti-Mormons would probably never let him leave the city alive. So what was Governor Ford to do? And an argument could be made that maybe he should have transported them all to Springfield and held the hearing there away from all of the pro and the anti-Mormon sentiments which gripped the local communities. Well, Governor Ford talks about this in his History of Illinois, page 349. Quote, "The question then arose, what would be proper to be done? A war was expected by everybody. I was desirous of preserving the peace. I could not put myself at the head of the Mormon force with any kind of propriety and without exciting greater odium against them than already existed. I could not put myself at the head of the anti-Mormon party because they had justly forfeited my confidence, and my command over them was put an end to by mutiny and treachery. I could not put myself at the head of either of those forces because both of them in turn had violated the law, and, as I then believed, meditated further aggression. It appeared to me that if war ensued, I ought to have a force in which I could confide, and that I ought to establish my headquarters at a place where I could learn the truth as to what was going on." End quote. Yeah, the conflict itself is what kept Governor Ford from taking the prisoners, removing the matter to a place where the conflict wasn't raging. He was sure that if he left at any point, the Mormons and the anti-Mormons would immediately go to war, and his presence was the only thing keeping them from going to war, even with Jo and Hyrum in the state's custody. Now, if he left and war broke out, how would that look on his career as governor? I mean, he was properly stuck. He didn't have any other option than to handle the matter domestically in the city of Carthage without making a single false step that would excite the conflict even more. Now, he further added, reflecting on this situation, that his hands were not only tied by the fury raging all around him, but by the legal system itself. Quote, "Some persons have supposed that I ought to have had them sent to some distant and friendly part of the state for confinement and trial, and that I ought to have searched them for concealed arms. But these surmises and suppositions are readily disposed of by the fact that they were not my prisoners, but were the prisoners of the constable and jailer, under the direction of the justice of the peace, and also by the fact that by law they could be tried in no other county than Hancock." End quote. So Governor Ford was there in Carthage handling this conflict to enforce the laws, not to make special exceptions to the laws because of extraordinary circumstances. All he could do was promise the safety of the prisoners and as impartial of a trial as possible. From the History of the Church, quote, "The governor was at headquarters in person and had pledged his own faith in the faith of the state of Illinois that the Smiths and the other prisoners should be protected from personal violence and should have a fair and impartial trial if they would surrender themselves to be dealt with according to law. During the governor's stay in Carthage, he repeatedly expressed to the legal councilors of the Smiths his determination to protect the prisoners and to see that they should have a fair and impartial trial." End quote. Jo, Hyrum, and the 16 other city councilmen, the conspirators who were charged with riots, spent the night of June 24th to 25th in Hamilton's hotel, which was filled to the brim with people who wanted each other dead, including some of the printers of the Nauvoo Expositor, as well as Joseph H. Jackson. Now, when everybody awoke, quote, "At 8 a.m., President Smith had an interview with William G. Flood of Quincy. While in conversation with him, Constable Bettesworth arrested Joseph for treason against the state of Illinois." End quote. So this is actually a new development. They were in Carthage having surrendered to Judge Morrison's original arrest warrant that was based on the charge of riot. But treason, let's just say that's a slightly greater offense than riot. And Jo didn't, after inciting the riot, he didn't have an underground bunker to hide in while he turned out the lights of the Nauvoo mansion. So what's this treason charge about? The history of the church includes the underlying complaints which led to the treason charges given by Augustine Spencer and Henry O. Norton. Now, a little refresher on Augustine Spencer. Augustine Spencer opposed the power of the Mormon Empire in Nauvoo, and then he got in a fight with his younger brother, Orson Spencer, who's a Joseph Smith crony. Jo took this matter personally, and he issued an arrest warrant for Augustine Spencer. When Augustine Spencer refused to be arrested by the Nauvoo Marshal, John P. Green, Jo and John P. Green attempted to get Charles and Robert Foster, expositor printers, to help him effect this arrest. After which, in the conflict here, Charles Foster pointed a pistol at the chest of Joseph Smith before the gun was wrestled from his hand, either by Joseph Smith or Robert E. Bob the Builder Foster, or by Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell. The accounts conflict as to who knocked the gun out of Charles' hands when he was pointing it at Joseph Smith. Well, Augustine Spencer was a domestic enemy of the church, and once all the men in this conflict were arrested and he was discharged, he fled to Carthage, the main safe haven for dissenters of the church, which is why the expositor printers and Joseph H. Jackson were staying in Carthage. Now, all this is back on episode 197 about the Fosters, if you need a refresher on the Augustine Spencer stuff. So this is the complaint by Augustine Spencer about treason for which Joseph Smith was arrested while already in state custody for the charge of riot. Quote, "Whereas complaint has been made upon the oath of Augustine Spencer that Joseph Smith, on or about the 19th day of June 1844, did commit the crime of treason against the government and the people of the state of Illinois. These are therefore to command you to take the said Joseph Smith, if he be found in your county, or if he shall have fled, that you pursue after the said Joseph Smith into another county within the state, and take and safely keep the said Joseph Smith, so that you have his body forthwith before me to answer the said complaint, and be further dealt with according to law." End quote. And then another complaint was filed by Henry O. Norton, who was another faithful member who'd been in deep conflict with the church for the past 2 years and was staying in Carthage because it wasn't safe for dissenters to be in Nauvoo. Quote, "Complaint has been made upon the oath of Henry O. Norton that one Hyrum Smith did on the 19th day of June commit the crime of treason against the government and the people of the state of Illinois." End quote. So in addition to the charges of riot, now Hyrum and Jo specifically were charged with treason on complaints of Augustine Spencer and Henry O. Norton, two defectors from the church. This charge was purely a result of them declaring martial law in Nauvoo and arresting people who protested at the time. They did this without the approval of the commander-in-chief of the Illinois militias, Governor Ford, and thereby committed treason and infringed on people's rights to peaceful assembly. We're going to get into the details of the charge later on in the show, but essentially it does amount to treason, and this is pretty reasonable because it was the presence of the Nauvoo Legion and the city police force during the destruction of the expositor which caused the riots in the first place. Armed officers destroying the printing press causes people to get really mad about stuff. Amazing how that works. They destroyed the printing press with force, and the people in the city protested. Then, when the criminals responsible for the press's destruction and the ensuing riot discharged themselves from their own criminal court, the people became even more enraged, to the point that it was unsafe for Jo and Hyrum in Nauvoo, and they had to flee the city. They declared martial law for their own safety alone, so that they could commit crimes in Nauvoo with impunity. Nauvoo policed itself, but who polices that policing? The citizens of Nauvoo groaned under these draconian measures, which is why one of the first things that Governor Ford did upon his arrival was force Joseph Smith to rescind the martial law declaration and disband the Nauvoo Legion and seize the Legion's weapons. While the Nauvoo Legion had begun as a state-sanctioned militia, the way that it had been used for the 4 years of its existence was to enforce an Orwellian system of absolute tyranny. The charges of riot may be dismissed based on the evidence produced by Jo's 2 sham hearings in Nauvoo, but the charges of treason required a greater attention to evidence and fact-finding that would understandably tie up Jo and Hyrum in jails and court for months to come, and certainly result in the revocation of the Nauvoo Charter. And revoking the Nauvoo Charter to stop corruption was one of the primary advocations in the Nauvoo Expositor, which led to its destruction to begin with. When the fascists make it illegal or impossible to oppose their power, who will be left to oppose them? That's kind of the point of making anti-fascism illegal, isn't it? Or declaring them terrorists. I digress. Back to the story. When Jo's posse entered Carthage 5 minutes before midnight, the people wanted a view of the prophet, many of them unable to recognize him because, well, Joseph Smith didn't have 81 million followers on Twitter, right? Most people didn't even know what the guy looked like. They just knew his name and knew what he was responsible for. So Governor Ford was able to assuage the infuriated mob by telling them that he would organize a public gathering the following morning for all of them to see the prophet and fiend in the flesh. All 18 men were in custody of the state, and Jo and Hyrum had the additional charges of treason on their rap sheet. From the history of the church, quote, 8:30 a.m. Governor Ford called all the troops and ordered them to form a hollow square on the public ground near the courthouse. And when informed, he mounted an old table and addressed them in a most inflammatory manner, exciting the feelings of indignation against Generals Joseph and Hyrum Smith, which were already burning in their breasts, occasioned by the falsehoods and misrepresentations that were in circulation, giving his assent and sanction to the rumors that had gathered them together, and stating that although they were dangerous men in the community and guilty of all that they might have alleged against them, still they were in the hands of the law, which must have its course. He continued speaking 20 or 30 minutes, end quote. So this passage from the history of the church strains credulity. Governor Ford was doing everything in his power to keep the 1,300 militiamen in Carthage from exacting vigilante justice. His parading Jo and the other prisoners through the town square in front of all the militiamen, that wasn't to rile them up. They were already sufficiently riled up to begin with. It was most likely done to put a human face on the demon these people imagined Jo to be for the past 4 years. His speech of 20 to 30 minutes this morning isn't recorded anywhere that I could find, but I'm pretty comfortable in stating that whatever he said was to calm the tensions, not exacerbate them, as the history of the church states. Beyond that, his actions immediately following the speech provide a window into just how much deference Ford was showing to the prisoners. Instead of simply locking them up and letting whatever happens happen, he kept Jo and Hyrum out in the public to talk to the people of the community under armed guard to keep from vigilante justice from happening. Quote, 9:15 a.m. The governor came and invited Joseph to walk with him through the troops. Joseph solicited a few moments' private conversation with him, which the governor refused. While refusing, the governor looked down at his shoes, as though he was ashamed, end quote. But he actually did end up granting a private conversation with Jo, just not yet, right? It's not that he refused to hold a private meeting with Jo. It's just that this wasn't the right time. Other more important issues needed to be dealt with first. Quote, they then walked through the crowd with Brigadier General Minor R. Deming and Dr. Richards to General Deming's quarters. The people appeared quiet until a company of Carthage Greys flocked around the doors of General Deming in an uproarious manner, of which notice was sent to the governor. In the meantime, the governor had ordered the McDonough troops to be drawn up in a line for Joseph and Hyrum to pass in front of them, they having requested that they might have a clear view of the Generals Smith, end quote. So the question is in my mind, why did Governor Ford walk Jo and Hyrum up and down the lines of the McDonough troops and the Demings troops and the Carthage Greys and all these other companies of the Illinois militia? I think it was to literally get the men to shake hands and meet face to face. When two groups of people have so thoroughly demonized each other, the only way to make headway to combat those deep human tendencies is to make dramatic efforts to force each side to see the other as human. See, Jo and Hyrum were powerless to do anything here, right? They were no threat to the militias that were there in Carthage. The militia in Carthage, under the command of Governor Ford, They held the lives of the prophet and patriarch in their hands. Joseph and Hyrum were extremely vulnerable here. Any false move resulting in Jo or Hyrum being hurt would immediately bring the Nauvoo Legion marching into Carthage before nightfall. Governor Ford made each of these guys literally shake the hands of their enemies. When our enemies change from a concept to a person with a face, we act more human towards each other. Shaking hands or kneeling in solidarity, that goes a lot further in reducing tensions than, firing rubber bullets or, tear gas canisters while, certain people are masked in combat gear. From the History of the Church, quote, "From the general's quarters, Joseph and Hyrum went in front of the lines in a hollow square of company of Carthage Greys. At 7 minutes before 10, they arrived in front of the lines and passed before the whole, Joseph being on the right of General Deming and Hyrum on his left. Elders Richards, Taylor, and Phelps following. Joseph and Hyrum were introduced by Governor Ford about 20 times along the line as General Joseph Smith and General Hyrum Smith, the governor walking in front on the left," end quote. Now, what's interesting here is Governor Ford was taking a risk. He had no real assurance other than the force of his vested authority that one of these men wouldn't crack a shot off at Jo or Hyrum as he was forcing all these men to shake hands. He was taking a massive risk with this display, but the payoff may assuage a civil war from assassinations, so the reward was worth the risk in his mind. As they were making this pass in front of the Carthage Greys and the McDonough troops, among all these other militiamen, Jo pulled Governor Ford to the side and apparently voiced some concern over Ford's plan to introduce Jo and Hyrum to everybody. Quote, "Joseph had a conversation with the governor about 10 minutes when he again pledged the faith of the state that he and his friends should be protected from violence," end quote. Joseph Smith, ever the coward, right? Didn't think that, shaking the hands of all these militiamen was a good idea, but Governor Ford's deportment was solemn and reassuring enough that Jo and Hyrum continued walking down the lines and shaking hands. But then the group got to the platoon of the Carthage Greys, the antagonists of all these events in Carthage. If Jo could be considered our protagonist, which I don't know how you feel about that. Quote, "The Carthage Greys refused to receive them by that introduction," as Generals Joseph and Hyrum Smith. "And some of the officers threw up their hats, drew their pistols and swords, and said they would introduce themselves to the damned Mormons in a different style," end quote. Just try to picture this scene. Jo and Hyrum are prisoners of the state, and Governor Ford, the governor of the state, is walking them down the line of Illinois militiamen and then telling them, "All right, boys, shake hands. I know you don't like each other, but shake hands or nobody gets their apple juice." Then they get to the Carthage Greys, who refuse to acknowledge Joseph and Hyrum as generals. They act all blustery and macho by drawing their swords and guns and talking a big game. Here's what happened next. Quote, "The governor mildly entreated them not to act so rudely, but their excitement increased. The governor, however, succeeded in pacifying them by making a speech and promising them that they should have full satisfaction," end quote. Whatever Governor Ford actually said there to, calm the Carthage Greys down, it's not written in the history of the church as, but what is here in the history of the church is written after the fact. So they could write it in a way that it's foreshadowing events that are 2 days ahead. But regardless of what the history of the church says, Ford said he was able to calm everybody down, even though these men didn't want to shake hands. And the day continued on from that point forward. Of all the folks caught up in this tension, the person that I'd like to meet and share a dirty whiskey with is definitely Governor Ford. I would love to pick his brain about this whole thing. He was able to keep a mob of over 1,000 men from killing their public enemies number 1 and 2, when Jo and Hyrum were essentially unarmed in handcuffs. I mean, we can't stop cops today from killing people in that scenario in the 21st century, but Governor Ford kept 19th century drunken mobocrats from killing the men in their custody. But Jo was obviously very worried about what was going on in Nauvoo during his absence. And look, a lot of people who've been dealing with his poor leadership for years just read in the Nauvoo Expositor that Jo was a tyrant with a dozen wives among him and his closest friends. For many Nauvoo citizens, the Mormonism described in the expositor was not the religion or the gods they believed in. And now the leadership, whose faults were highlighted in the expositor, they destroyed the press to silence those critical voices. But the damage was done. The insurrection wasn't just the printers of the expositor. Hundreds or thousands of Nauvoo members were now questioning their decisions and their religious convictions. Now, Jo and Hyrum, most of the city council, were locked in essentially jail, facing charges of riot after an overtly tyrannical act. Jo's grasp on the people of Nauvoo was slipping. Yes, but there was also a greater danger, and that was the threat of confusion and other state militias working under direction of themselves instead of under the direction of Governor Ford. Now that the highest-ranking commanding officers of the Nauvoo Legion were in state custody, and the Legion itself was disbanded by order of the governor, Nauvoo was a sitting duck for its enemies. Any vigilante mob with misdirected anger that wanted to exact revenge on the Mormons at large instead of just the leadership who was responsible for their woes, they can make pretty short work of invading the city and wreaking chaos on people that they believe to be their enemies. Now, Jo was understandably stressed by this, not only about the safety of the Mormons, but also about the safety of his throne upon his eventual return to the kingdom. He petitioned Governor Ford multiple times during these morning exercises and the meet and greets for a conversation to tell him that a separate militia was needed to guard Nauvoo. Quote, "Intelligence was given to Joseph that the Laws, Higbees, Fosters, and others were going to Nauvoo to plunder. The governor called at the door with some gentlemen when Joseph informed him of what he had heard and requested him to send a guard to protect the city of Nauvoo. The governor communicated that he had ordered Captain Singleton with a company of men from McDonough County to march to Nauvoo to cooperate with the police in keeping the peace, and he would call out the Legion if necessary." End quote. So were the Higbees, Fosters, and Laws actually headed to Nauvoo to plunder? Well, they'd be stopped immediately if they were trying to plunder property. But what if they were trying to plunder souls? Look, William Law was designated as the president of the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints when it was formed only 1 month ago in May of 1844. William Law had called his own quorum of apostles, his own bishop, and more importantly, he called the Nauvoo leadership to repentance, and he told members that they could join the True Church with their preaching license that was already granted by Jo's Nauvoo church. That was one of the primary reasons the expositor was so quickly dealt with. It was a paper not just printed as an expose of the Nauvoo leadership, but also as the foundational press for the rival church that the printers had formed. You silence a press in this day, you silence a movement. And with Jo's absence ringing through the streets of Nauvoo, the True Church, led by the much less controversial William Law, was an appealing proposition to many members who were sick of Joseph Smith's constant outrage. The growth of the True Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in scare quotes, in the face of Jo's church and his current absence, would be completely unopposed with Jo and his cronies locked up, or, like many of his apostles were, they were all across the nation and preaching and electioneering for him. How could he retain control? So Governor Ford heard the pleas of Jo and Hyrum that Nauvoo was in danger without them there. Ford had also removed the Nauvoo Legion's arms that were provided by the state, leaving them understandably defenseless, of course, should any rival state militia march into the town. This conversation between Jo and Ford was consequential enough that Governor Ford even reported about that conversation and his response, which was conducted in the way that a good governor and commander-in-chief should act given the circumstances. Quote, "Soon after the surrenders of the Smiths, at their request, I dispatched Captain Singleton with his company from Brown County to Nauvoo to guard the town, and I authorized him to take command of the Legion. He reported to me afterwards that he called out the Legion for inspection, and that upon 2 hours' notice, 2,000 of them assembled, all of them armed. And this after the public arms had been taken away from them. So it appears that they had a sufficiency of private arms for any reasonable purpose." End quote. And I would add unreasonable purposes as well. Bear arms, well-regulated militia, It turns out that the state clawing back the arms that they had provided to the Nauvoo Legion didn't really do much good because the Mormons were independently armed to the teeth already. And no order from any governor would seize their private guns, no matter how great a threat they were, because America! I assume that Jo calculated that the presence of the militia there in Nauvoo would allow him to retain power in absentia, while he and his most powerful elites were nowhere near the city. The Fosters, the Higbees, and the Laws, they were still in Carthage, but word of their return to Nauvoo was assuaged by the Brown County militia heading to Nauvoo to retain control, meaning that the state militia as well as these dissenters would probably be arriving in Nauvoo around the same time. The militia would aid the city police, who were still loyal to Jo, in putting down any gatherings of people and instating curfews and halting protests and chasing people back into their homes. And if the groups couldn't be dispersed, they would, put these curfews in place, and they would probably send the people home with tear gas and rubber bullets if they didn't disperse. Now that Nauvoo was sorted out by request from Jo to Governor Ford, some other more immediate troubles arose in Carthage, the Carthage Greys. Now, the Carthage Greys had refused to shake Jo and Hyrum's hands. They refused to acknowledge them as generals. And they were just too haughty. They were just too prideful to see their enemy as anything other than inhuman. Quote, "News reached Joseph at the hotel that the Carthage Greys had revolted and were put under guard by General Deming. Joseph told all his friends to stay in the 2 rooms occupied by them in the hotel." End quote. So the McDonough County militia could be better relied on than the Carthage Greys, just by sheer virtue of the respective militia compositions. The Carthage Greys were made up of citizens of Carthage, one of the twin cities that comprised the hotbed of anti-Mormonism, the other city being Warsaw, where Thomas Sharp published his openly anti-Mormon paper, The Warsaw Signal. We've read a lot of articles from the Warsaw Signal, especially leading up to what's going on here. The McDonough boys, however, were in the next county east from Adams and Hancock counties, where all of this rivalry was going on. So the citizens of McDonough County were far less affected by the Mormon Empire, whether that be with shady business practices and counterfeit money or Mormon political chess or whatever was causing all of the anti-Mormons to be so mad in Carthage and Warsaw. The McDonough County citizens weren't suffering that as much as Carthage and Warsaw for the past 5 years. So simply put, the Carthage Greys were anti-Mormons. The McDonough County militia were there to support orders from Governor Ford, even though some of the McDonough County militia had friends in the Carthage Greys. Now, no group before or since has been as overtly anti-Mormon as the Carthage Greys. With them riled up into this fury, Jo was forced to tell all of his boys to stay in the hotel, don't go downstairs, and certainly don't go outside, or the Carthage Greys will revolt from Governor Ford's command. Ford was able to calm them down, but would that last for the rest of the day? Would Ford's ability to keep the Carthage Greys calm last for the rest of the week? Jo was getting constant intel while locked up in Hamilton's hotel awaiting the trial that would happen that afternoon. Quote, "It was reported by Israel Barlow that he had heard resolutions of the Warsaw troops read to the effect that they would return to Warsaw at 3 p.m., then go to Golden's Point on Thursday, and thence to Nauvoo." End quote. This was crucial intel. These are Colonel Levi Williams' boys. Now, Levi Williams is basically the anti-Mormon poster boy who would later stand trial for assassinating Jo and Hyrum. Intel that the Warsaw militia under Levi Williams' command was headed to Nauvoo was crucial and dire. Now, it was hoped that Singleton's men would get to Nauvoo to command the disbanded legion and defend against Williams' men if they made an attack on the city. But could the men from Brown County and Singleton's command be trusted to not commit mutiny and simply join Levi Williams' troops in burning Nauvoo to ash? Singleton was trusted by Governor Ford, but the men that he commanded were much harder to trust or control. As this intel came to Joseph from Israel Barlow, Jo took a number of meetings at the hotel without leaving for legitimate fear that his life was in danger. In this prison of sorts, he was something of a spectacle, and some of these interactions were reported in the history of the church, although the exact words exchanged between Jo and his visitors are really hard to nail down, as this was all recreated after the fact, meaning that George A. Smith could basically make Jo say whatever he wanted him to say just for readers who were reading the history of the church. This is what George A. Smith says about it anyway. Quote, "Several of the officers of the troops in Carthage and other gentlemen, curious to see the prophet and to gratify a propensity to see the elephant," that last little phrase, that was actually cut from the history of the church, but Dan Vogel's restored it from the original document. I love that. To gratify a propensity to see the elephant. They cut that out because they didn't want readers to think Joseph Smith was an elephant. Anyway, visited Joseph in his room. General Smith asked them if there was anything in his appearance that indicated he was the desperate character his enemies represented him to be, and he asked them to give their honest opinion on the subject. The reply was, "No, sir, your appearance would indicate the very contrary, General Smith, but we cannot see what is in your heart, neither can we tell what are your intentions." To which Joseph replied, "Very true, gentlemen. You cannot see what is in my heart, and you are therefore unable to judge me or my intentions, but I can see what is in your hearts, and will tell you what I see. I can see your thirst for my blood, and nothing but my blood will satisfy you. It is not for crime of any description that I and my brethren are thus continually persecuted and harassed by our enemies, but there are other motives, and some of them I have expressed so far as related to myself. And inasmuch as you and the people thirst for blood, I prophesy in the name of the Lord that you shall witness scenes of blood and sorrow to your entire satisfaction. Your souls shall be perfectly satiated with blood, and many of you who are now present shall have an opportunity to face the cannon's mouth from sources you think not of. And those people that desire this great evil upon me and my brethren shall be filled with regret and sorrow because of the scenes of desolation and distress that await them. They shall seek for peace and shall not be able to find it. Gentlemen, you'll find what I have told you to be true." End quote. Imagine having the audacity to bring an entire state to the brink of civil war, surrendering to your enemies and being locked essentially in a prison. It was a hotel, but it was serving as a prison. And then telling your aggressors to their faces that they will find blood and be fired upon by cannons from sources they don't think of. He has the arrogance to threaten their lives in this moment. Imagine if an unarmed black man with an officer pointing a gun at him told the officer that he will witness scenes of blood and sorrow for thirsting for the man's blood. The cop would probably shoot him if he hadn't already shot him as soon as the man mentioned a cannon that the officer can't see. I digress again, but the point remains that Jo wasn't trying to calm the fury of the people. He was playing into the us versus them mentality. He had manufactured an empire that benefited from war if he could make it out alive. He was acting aggressively while surrounded by his enemies in a city of people who wanted him dead. And his aggression here proves that he thought he'd get out of all of this alive, even before tear gas was even invented. Well, Jo, you stoke the fires of war, everybody gets burned. Sometime before, during, or after these visits, it's kind of hard to nail down the exact timeline here, Jo wrote to Pistol Packin' Porter and to his first wife, Emma. Now, the letter to Emma survives. The message to Port was probably verbal and never written because Porter Rockwell was illiterate. So a lot is revealed in these messages, though. First, let's talk about the letter to Emma after Jo had considerably longer conversation with Governor Ford. Quote, "Dear Emma, I've had an interview with Governor Ford, and he treats us honorably. Myself and Hyrum have been again arrested for treason because we called out the Nauvoo Legion. But when the truth comes out, we have nothing to fear. We all feel calm and composed. This morning, Governor Ford introduced myself and Hyrum to the militia in a very appropriate manner as General Joseph Smith and General Hyrum Smith. There was a little mutiny among the Carthage Greys, but I think the governor has and will succeed in enforcing the laws. I do hope the people of Nauvoo will continue pacific and prayerful. If only Joseph Smith was a prophet and could see events just 2 days in the future. He continues, Governor Ford has just concluded to send some of his militia to Nauvoo to protect the citizens, and I wish that they may be kindly treated. They will cooperate with the police to keep the peace. The governor's orders will be read in the hearing of the police and officers of the Legion, I suppose. P.S. 3 o'clock. The governor has just agreed to march his army to Nauvoo, and I shall come along with him. The prisoners, all that can, will be admitted to bail. I am, as ever, signed Joseph Smith. End quote. Jo wrote this letter to Emma too hastily. First off, the governor did treat Jo and Hyrum with respect and appropriately when he marched the two of them, down the line of all of these Carthage militiamen and had everybody shake hands. Introducing them as generals was also appropriate, and that obviously carried considerable weight for all these militiamen who were colonels, majors, and privates and the like. You see two generals walking in front of you, you pay them their respects. Ford did agree to send Captain Singleton's militia to aid the Nauvoo police in keeping the peace. However, Joe's third point after his interview with Governor Ford is a bit more questionable. Apparently, Ford had agreed that the prisoners would receive bail after the forthcoming hearing, which we'll get into in just a minute here. And Ford would bring Jo and Hyrum to Nauvoo under armed escort for their bail, with the understanding that they'd appear in the coming hearing, which ended up being scheduled for June 29th. Like I said, we're going to get into the hearing in just a minute. It is notable, however, that after the hearing, Jo and Hyrum were deemed too high risk to be released on bail. They had plenty of resources to pay the bail, but they were obviously a flight risk, right? Jo and Hyrum had done nothing to gain the confidence of the legal system and Governor Ford here, right? The Carthage court had absolutely no assurance that Hyrum and Joseph would return to Carthage once released on bail, so they were interred in the city jail after the hearing that afternoon. What is particularly notable about this is Jo probably had the agreement from Ford that he'd return to Nauvoo on bail and therefore felt comfortable in acting aggressively towards these visitors. If Ford told him that he'd be back in Nauvoo by the following day, he'd once again be surrounded by his legion and a veritable army of his sycophants, and he'd break the state of Illinois into war after refusing to return to fulfill his bail requirements. This is all hypothetical, obviously, because Jo didn't leave that jail while still alive. But, well, I mean, he did leave the jail alive, but it was out a window in a courtyard with 150 men who immediately killed him, right? Now let's talk about the message to Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell, which was never written, just transmitted orally by the same messenger who carried the message to Emma, Stephen Markham, Piggy Bank Steve. Quote, Joseph also sent a message to Orrin Porter Rockwell not to come to Carthage, but to stay in Nauvoo and not to suffer himself to be delivered into the hands of his enemies or to be taken prisoner by anyone. End quote. Port, don't come to Carthage. This is further evidence to me that Jo fully expected to return to Nauvoo within 2 days' time. Porter Rockwell was well known in Carthage. When John C. Reckitt Bennett had been excommunicated from the church, and during the Bennett meltdown, right, he began collecting affidavits and making public allegations that Porter Rockwell was the guy who pulled the trigger on Governor Lilburn Boggs in Missouri. Porter Rockwell confronted John Bennett in Carthage, where Bennett was hiding out from the Danites, because Carthage was the only place that was safe for dissenters from the church. And because this confrontation was in public and Bennett was smart enough to never be alone when the Danites were hunting him, Bennett and Porter Rockwell got in a fight at one of the taverns there in Carthage. The people removed Porter from that tavern and they chased him out of the city, after which Porter Rockwell went into hiding and he traveled across Illinois to Indiana, where he hid for months before he was apprehended on his return trip to Nauvoo and extradited to Missouri, where he spent months in jail. That's all back in 1842. All that to say, the Carthaginians knew Porter Rockwell by his face, and if he showed up in Carthage, they'd suspect that he was up to no good, and who knows what would happen. So Jo telling Port not to come to Carthage here was protection for Port and protection from the city exploding into chaos while he was teetering on the precipice of doing so with Jo and Hyrum locked up in Hamilton's hotel. So now we can finally get to the hearing that afternoon. Now, this is essentially titled a quote-unquote examination of Jo and the 17 other defendants who were charged for riot. The only record that I can find of it comes from Whiteout Willard Richards, who hastily scratched the proceedings in his journal as it took place, doing his best to kind of shorthand. You'll find a link to his journal in the show notes. But first, I'm going to read the introduction to the hearing in Whiteout Willard Richards' journal from the Joseph Smith papers, because it illuminates why we're going to struggle through it. Quote, "Following are Willard Richards' hastily written notes taken during an examination of Joseph Smith and other defendants in the Nauvoo Expositor riot case, held before Justice of the Peace Robert Smith at Artois Hamilton's Hotel in Carthage, Illinois. The fragmentary nature of the record precludes a thorough understanding of the arguments made by the prosecution, the defense, and the court in the course of the hearing. Accounts written shortly afterward, however, indicate that the court decided to release the prisoners on bail, with instructions to appear at the next term of the circuit court, only after hearing great exertions from the defense counsel and a good deal of resistance from the prosecution." End quote. So that's a bit of an overview from the Joseph Smith papers of this court hearing that's recounted in Willard Richards' journal. So let's dive into this fateful hearing. First off, let me describe the battlefield. Notably, the prosecuting attorney on behalf of Hancock County here was Chauncey L. Higbee, one of the primary antagonists of the church in Joseph Smith, as well as one of the 7 printers of the Expositor. Apparently, there wasn't enough of a conflict of interest for Higbee to recuse himself from being the prosecuting attorney in this hearing. Regardless, that's one of the first errors in this hearing. But the attorneys on the defense side for Jo and his boys were James Woods and Hugh T. Reed. It's interesting to have James Woods defending a criminally insane tyrant in 1844 as well as in 2018. It's wonderful how history is circular. I'm going to do my best to work through Willard Richards' notes here. They are a mess, and I'll summarize it at the end of it, but just please bear with me. I'm going to try my best, and you can read it for yourself. Once again, Willard Richards' journal is in the show notes. It's under the date of June 25th, 1844. Quote, "Chauncey L. Higbee mentioned an affidavit not here, moved for an adjournment, and read a law. What the law is here, we don't know, because Willard Richards was writing it so quickly. So Chauncey L. Higbee said, we don't have enough evidence here. I need to pull an affidavit that is not available to me. We should move for an adjournment to provide enough time for myself, the prosecuting attorney, to acquire the evidence and the witness statements necessary for a proper prosecution." Then it goes on, "Hugh Reed and blank objected to an adjournment." So Hugh Reed and James Woods, who were Jo's defense counsel here, objected to the adjournment, said court was not authorized to take recognizance without their acknowledging their guilt or having witnesses to prove that we admit the press was destroyed. Read another law. It doesn't say what law it is. To show that justice could not recognize without admission of guilt. Essentially, they don't have the witnesses. You don't have the proper charges to keep us locked up here. Therefore, you have to release us if you don't have something that proves any sort of guilt. Then it says, offered to give bail or asked illegible discharge. Law was stated by Reed to belong to civil, not criminal cases. Now, that's an interesting point as well, because this is where it really breaks down. If this was charges of riot, then it is a criminal case. If this was just you destroyed my property, then that is a civil case. So Reed, Joseph Smith's counsel here, Hugh T. Reed, was trying to say that this belongs to a civil case, not a criminal charge of riot. Therefore, we should be able to have bail for discharge here. Then state insisted to have commission on crime acknowledged. Court asked if the parties admitted there was sufficient to cause to bind over. Right. So state, being Chauncey L. Higbee, said we need a commission to figure out if a crime was here, if the crime of riot was actually committed here. And if that's the case, then there will be sufficient cause to bind them over, which means either lock them up or release them only on bail, right? And the council admitted there was sufficient cause to bind over with cognizance in common form. Court acknowledged the admission and ordered cognizances at 5 p.m. So the court said, okay, so this is a criminal case. We have to try this for the charges of riot that these 18 men are charged for. Therefore, we're going to keep them imprisoned or we're going to let them out on bail. Now, this is what Willard Richards records after they determined that this was a criminal case and that they could be released on bail. Quote, most of the brethren left for Nauvoo after Joseph Smith, John Taylor, William Wines Phelps, Hyrum Smith, John P. Green, Stephen Perry, Dimmick B. Huntington, Jonathan Dunham, Stephen Markham, Jonathan Dunham, Holmes, Jesse P. Harmon, John Little, Joseph W. Coolidge, Harvey D. Redfield, Orrin Porter Rockwell, and Levi Richards had given bonds, 5 in each bond, 15 in all, with sureties in the sum of $500 each, $7,500 in total. End quote. Okay, so that was the entire hearing. And you see why I had to read the introduction from the Joseph Smith papers, because it describes how it accurately describes how hastily it was written and how the people attending knew what was going on. But us reading the record in hindsight, we kind of have to make guesses and assumptions based on what Whiteout Willard Richards wrote. But regardless, the conclusion was clear. The offenders were charged with riot in a criminal court. This is not to be held at a civil litigation level of destruction of a person's property. So the offenders were released on bail totaling $7,500, which is just over $250,000 in 2020 money. However, this hearing was on the charges of riot for the 18 involved individuals. That included Jo and Hyrum and those various city councilors who passed that resolution that declared the expositor a public nuisance and destroyed the press. The charges of treason against Jo and Hyrum specifically were still active and required a separate hearing. Also worth noting, this hearing wasn't an actual jury trial. It was considered an investigation, kind of like the November 1838 Court of Inquiry. It was only conducted to determine whether there was enough evidence to charge the offenders with the stated crimes and to begin an investigation and discovery. The 16 men were released on bail, which means there was enough evidence to charge them and that they would be held over for that $250,000 if they didn't appear for the subsequent jury trial, which was scheduled for June 29th. The state had to gather evidence and material witnesses who weren't present during this investigation, so it was postponed until that date of June 29th for an actual trial. Jo and Hyrum, however, being charged with treason separately, that wasn't at issue or under investigation in this hearing. They would be held in Carthage Jail for treason. Governor Ford reflects on this hearing in his History of Illinois. Quote, on the 23rd or 24th day of June, Jo Smith, the mayor of Nauvoo, together with his brother Hyrum and all the members of the city council and all others demanded, came into Carthage and surrendered themselves prisoners to the constable on the charge of riot. They all voluntarily entered into a recognizance before the justice of the peace for their appearance at court to answer the charge, and all of them were discharged from custody except Jo and Hyrum Smith, against whom the magistrate had issued a new writ on complaint of treason. They were immediately arrested by the constable on this charge and retained in his custody to answer it. End quote. After that, however, Governor Ford discusses how the charge of treason was calculated by the enemies of Jo and Hyrum. And let's do a little bit of background, because this taps into a legal doctrine known as the posse comitatus, a subject that's been in the headlines a bit recently and trending on Twitter. It's essentially the practice of a civil officer like a mayor or a president, let's say, using the military as a police force. The two divisions of law enforcement are supposed to remain separate because police officers are supposed to live in the communities which they police, while the military comes from anywhere and they may not know much about the area in which they are called to act as the police. This posse comitatus was considered a problematic practice and was one of the primary reasons the Nauvoo city formed a police force when they already had the Nauvoo Legion. The Legion was supposed to be the well-regulated state-sanctioned militia for armed conflicts. The police force is supposed to be separate, and they're supposed to be the dudes in blue who patrol the city and make sure that the people are being good citizens, or, tackling them and kneeling on their necks until they die. When the military is called in to do the job of the cops, you run the risk of a military police state. And that harkens back to the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution about quartering soldiers, right? The Federalists didn't like that the Commonwealth considered occupying soldiers to be an acceptable practice. And the Fourth Amendment was created to insulate citizens from a military police force and to discourage presidents from using military as the police force. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the practice of posse comitatus was outlawed, as the southern states were infuriated by Union soldiers occupying them during the Reconstruction era. So the charge of treason against Jo and Hyrum centered around this same doctrine that a mayor or a president can't simply declare martial law and engage in posse comitatus because he did something that was unpopular with constituents and caused a riot. We start doing that, we slip further into a military state, and no haven of liberty that America claims to be can withstand the acts of a tyrant using his military as the police, the way that Jo and Hyrum did. So here's Governor Ford's commentary on the charge of treason against Jo and Hyrum within the context of using the Nauvoo Legion as a posse comitatus. From Governor Ford's History of Illinois, quote, "The overt act of treason charged against them consisted in the alleged levying of war against the state by declaring martial law in Nauvoo and ordering out the Legion to resist posse comitatus. Their actual guiltiness of the charge would depend upon circumstances. If their opponents had been seeking to put the law in force in good faith and nothing more, then an array of a military force in open resistance to the posse comitatus and the militia of the state most probably would have amounted to treason. But if those opponents merely intended to use the process of law, the militia of the state, and the posse comitatus as cat's paws to compass the possessions of their persons for the purpose of murdering them afterwards, as the sequel demonstrated the fact to be, it might well be doubted whether they were guilty of treason." End quote. So, yes, without the rising conflict between Carthage and Nauvoo for the previous 4 years, it may have been determined in a court of law that Jo and Hyrum had committed treason by their invocation of the posse comitatus and martial law, but the charge seemed clearly to be a ploy to get them locked in jail to exact vigilante justice. So let's talk about that arrest after this hearing that allowed the other 16 men to go back to Nauvoo on bail. The charges for treason were filed, and the prisoners that were all released on bail after the hearing that afternoon, they were headed back to Nauvoo, for the most part. Some of them stayed. But Jo and Hyrum returned to their room in Hamilton's hotel. On the main floor of the hotel, Joe's buddy, Dan Jones, a Danite, overheard a conversation between Wilson Law and Joseph H. Jackson, two of Joe's main antagonists in this story. Quote, "Dan Jones heard Wilson Law, whilst endeavoring to get another warrant against Joseph Smith for treason, declare that while he was once preaching from Daniel 1st chapter, verse 44, Mr. Smith said that the kingdom referred to was already set up, and that he was king over it." He did. Joseph Smith did that. He had himself anointed prophet, priest, and king over all of Israel, over the whole world. He also heard Joseph H. Jackson and other leaders of the mob declare that they had 18 accusations against Joseph, and as one failed, they would try another to detain him there, and that they had so much trouble and hazard and worked so hard in getting him to Carthage that they would not let him get out alive. Jackson pointed to his pistols and said, "The balls are in there that will decide his case." Dan Jones immediately went upstairs to Joseph and informed him what he had heard Jackson say. End quote. Now, what those 18 charges were that Jackson talked about, we'll never know. But the thing is, many of Joe's actions were against the spirit of the law, but often not necessarily against the letter of the law, right? Joseph was a religious leader while being the mayor of the city and a commander-in-chief of the Nauvoo Legion, and he abused all three offices to create his theocratic kingdom on the Mississippi. This was a flagrant abuse of power as well as an abuse of the wall of separation between church and state. But Supreme Court cases and the lemon test that we use today to determine if certain laws or actions break that wall of separation, that didn't exist at the time. But that didn't stop it from feeling wrong and being against the spirit of the law. Other actions were less quantifiable, but equally frustrating. Joe's co-opting of the Nauvoo Municipal Court had sent case after case to the circuit court at Carthage through the appeals process. But how does somebody impeach an entire city's court system for an abuse of power? Was calling out the Nauvoo Legion and declaring martial law actually treason? It was certainly an abuse of power, but determining if it constituted treason was a bit more complicated. Besides, do you try Joseph Smith as a mayor and keep everything in the civil courts, or do you throw the book at him and try his conduct in court-martials because he was also lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion? Other criminal acts, were much more clear, were much simpler, and didn't violate just the spirit of the law, but the letter of the law, like harboring fugitives like Jeremiah Smith, Joe's distant cousin, who was running from the law on counterfeiting and theft charges. Jeremiah Smith was discharged via the Nauvoo Municipal Court, and he could claim double jeopardy if another court attempted to try him. But it was a sham hearing to begin with, and the fact that he found refuge in Nauvoo was a criminal act itself by Joseph Smith harboring a fugitive from justice. Overall, the problem with Joseph Smith in the 1840s legal sphere is a problem that we see in 2020. The wheels of justice churn slowly, but what happens when a criminal like Joseph Smith creates a system of flagrant abuse of power and then insulates himself from any legal ramifications by appointing only his most loyal friends to jobs that are intended to oversee his conduct and root out corruption? Add into this the constant onslaught of propaganda and tribalism that Joe spewed in public that kept the outrage machine running above capacity his entire life. Joseph Smith so deeply poisoned the well of regular conduct of elected officials. He so effectively crafted a reality for the Mormons where the world was against them, and anything negative about their divine leader, that was apostate or Gentile mobocrats who were attacking the gospel or fake news, right? Joe didn't just hold up a Bible in front of a church. He wrote the Bible and built the church and commanded his army of Israel to destroy dissenting voices in the city, and then declared martial law to ensure his power was safe. Simply put, the structure of society that we all agree to abide by couldn't handle the output of one mastermind criminal in Joseph Smith. History repeats itself. That being said, Jo and Hyrum were in Hamilton's hotel after that hearing, which discharged the other 16 men on bail. They took dinner with Governor Ford, and they talked with him for a while about what had transpired. And then he took his leave from the engagement, and Constable Bettesworth, the original constable who tried to arrest Joe in Nauvoo immediately after the expositor was destroyed, served an arrest warrant on Jo and Hyrum. Quote, "At 8 p.m., Constable Bettesworth appeared at the lodgings of Joseph and Hyrum and insisted that they should go to jail. Joseph demanded a copy of the minimus, which was refused. Messrs. Woods and Reed, as counsel to the prophet, insisted the prisoners were entitled to be brought before a justice of the peace for examination before they could be sent to jail. The constable, to their surprise, then exhibited the following minimus." Now here is the minimus to arrest them. Whereas Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith, having been arrested upon oath of Augustine Spencer and Henry O. Norton for the crime of treason, and have been brought before me as a justice of the peace in and for the said county for trial at the seat of justice thereof, which trial has been necessarily postponed by reason of the absence of material witnesses. Therefore, I command you in the name of the people to receive the said Joseph Smith and Hyrum Smith into your custody in the jail of the county aforesaid, and there to remain until discharged by due course of law. Signed, R.F. Smith, Justice of the Peace. End quote. Of course, Constable Bettesworth had the proper documentation to commit Jo and Hyrum to Carthage Jail, based on the charges of treason that were filed by Augustine Spencer and Henry Norton. Jo doth protest too much, though. Quote, Joseph remonstrated against such barefaced, illegal, and tyrannical proceedings, but the constable still insisted that they should go to jail. Lawyer Woods requested the officer to wait until he could see Governor Ford and was told by Bettesworth that he could only wait 5 minutes. Joseph and Hyrum again remonstrated, and the constable waited until about 9 o'clock, when they heard by Mr. Wood that the governor did not think it within the sphere of his duty to interfere, as they were in the hands of the civil law, and therefore he had no power to stay the process of the due course of law, and that he could not interrupt a civil officer in the discharge of his duty. End quote. Just because Jo doesn't want to go to jail doesn't mean the person serving the legal process is committing, quote, barefaced, illegal, and tyrannical proceedings, end quote. Arguably, the whole reason Jo was tangling with the legal system right now was because of his own tyranny. Wait, that's not even arguable. That's just the facts. This is a typical case of, I'm not a tyrant, you are. I didn't collude with Russia, the Democrats did. Jo has reliably demonstrated his disdain for the law, and it doesn't matter how much he and his older brother are remonstrating against the due process of law, they would have to do what the cop says or he's going to put them in a chokehold until they die. Wait, sorry. Jo and Hyrum were white and their crimes were white collar. That would never happen. Sorry, my mistake. I don't know. I just, you know, I make mistakes like that too often. Besides, them going to Governor Ford to nullify this mitimus, this arrest warrant, that would go against the entire reason that Governor Ford was there to begin with. Ford was only in Carthage to ensure faithful execution of the law, not to interfere with it. They were going to Carthage Jail, and it didn't matter how much they said that they can't breathe. I forgot. They were taken peacefully to jail without any physical force, even though the crimes they committed were treason instead of just, accidentally using a counterfeit $20 bill. Yeah, they were making counterfeit. They didn't accidentally use a counterfeit bill. No, but it was peaceful, right? They were peacefully taken to the jail, even though they were arguing with Governor Ford, the governor of the state, that they shouldn't be taken to jail. Now, after this, in the history of the church, George A. Smith spends an entire page of the history of the church declaring how illegal this mitimus was and decrying Governor Ford's lack of action in putting a stop to it. I'm not going to bore you with the propaganda because, frankly, it's all wrong and it's predicated on the idea that Jo and Hyrum weren't actually guilty of the crimes that they very clearly committed. However, when the mitimus was served, John Taylor, second prophet of the Utah church, immediately burst into Governor Ford's quarters and demanded some answers. Here's the conversation, according to John Taylor, that he remembered after the fact. So take it with a grain of salt. And it's kind of a long conversation. I'm going to just provide some general commentary as we go. Quote, Elder John Taylor says, As I was informed of this illegal proceeding, I went immediately to the governor and informed him of it. Whether he was apprised of it before or not, I do not know. He was apprised of the situation. He knew that what was going to happen. But my opinion is that he was. I represented to him the character of the parties who made the oath, the outrageous nature of the charge, the indignity offered to men in the position which they occupy, and that he knew very well that it was a vexatious prosecution, and that they were not guilty of any such thing. So the indignity offered to men in the position which they occupied. So if a person is a high enough elected official, they can't commit a crime. That's the argument that John Taylor was making to Governor Ford here. The governor replied that he was very sorry that the thing had occurred, that he did not believe the charges, but that he thought that was the best thing to be done in the premises, was to let the law take its course. Yeah, because Governor Ford was there to just make sure the law was enforced the proper way, not to interfere with the law. And having this hearing on the charge of treason was the due process of law. Committing Joseph and Hyrum to Carthage Jail was the due process of law. If Governor Ford made an exception in this case and nullified that minimus, he would be violating the law as the governor. John Taylor continues. I then reminded him that we had come out there at his instance, not to satisfy the law, which we had done before, but the prejudices of the people in relation to the affair of the press. Now, that's the whole point of having the Nauvoo Municipal Court hearings that were sham trials to begin with, right? We didn't come out here to have this hearing at Carthage to satisfy the law. We did it to satisfy the prejudices of the people because we already determined in the Nauvoo Municipal Court that no criminal wrongdoing had happened. And Joseph Smith captured that point when he wrote his letter to Governor Ford saying that if we try this in Carthage, if I surrender to this arrest, then it's double jeopardy. But once again, the Nauvoo Criminal Court was a criminal court. It was constructed and moved and shaped by Joseph Smith himself to make sure that he would never be held to account for any crime whatsoever. Taylor continues, making the argument to Governor Ford, that we had given bonds which we could not by law be required to do to satisfy the people at his instance, and that it was asking too much to require gentlemen in their position in life to suffer the degradation of being immured in a jail at the instance of such worthless scoundrels as those who had made this affidavit. Yeah, their position. Oh, Joseph Smith is a mayor. He is a prophet. He is a lieutenant general of a state-sanctioned militia. How dare you lock him up in jail? Well, maybe that explains why Joseph Smith kept amping it up and kept, he was running for president. You reach a high enough station in politics or in whatever, you're never held to account for any crime whatsoever. Problems in the 1840s that seem to have survived to this day. The governor replied that it was an unpleasant affair and it looked hard, but that it was a matter over which he had no control, as it belonged to the judiciary, that he, as the executive, could not interfere with their proceedings, and that he had no doubt but that they would be immediately dismissed. Governor Ford was not there to interfere with the proceedings. He was there as the executive of the state to make sure that the law is executed appropriately. Taylor replies, I told him that we had looked to him for protection from such insults, and that I thought we had a right to do so from the solemn promises he had made to me and Dr. Bernheisel in relation to our coming without a guard or arms, that we had relied upon his faith and had a right to expect him to fulfill his engagements after we had placed ourselves implicitly under his care and complied with all his requests, although extrajudicial. Yeah. Just because Joseph and Hyrum are locked in jail doesn't mean that Governor Ford is violating his oaths of protection to those men. He was there to enforce the laws, not to violate or make exceptions to the laws. He replied that he would detail a guard if we required it and see us protected, but that he could not interfere with the judiciary. Governor Ford's got a level head. I can't interfere with the judiciary. If you think that them going to jail is going to be a problem, I'll detail a special guard of people that I trust. If you require it to make sure that they're protected, I'll uphold my oath to protect Joseph and Hyrum Smith, but I can't interfere with the judicial branch. I'm the executive branch. I can't interfere with them. That's a balance of power issue. I expressed my dissatisfaction at the course taken and told him that if we were to be subject to mob rule and to be dragged contrary to law into prison at the instance of every infernal scoundrel whose oath could be bought for a dram of whiskey, his protection availed very little, and we had miscalculated his promises. And apparently that's his mic drop, because then he says, seeing that there was no protection of redress from the governor, I returned to the room and found the constable Bettesworth very urgent to hurry brothers Joseph and Hyrum to prison, whilst the brethren were remonstrating with him. At the same time, a great rabble was gathered in the streets and around the door, and form the rowdyism manifested. Rowdyism is oddly a real word. I didn't think they would be. And from the rowdyism manifested, I was afraid there was a design to murder the prisoners on the way to the jail. Without conferring with any person, my next feeling was to procure a guard. And seeing a man habited as a soldier in the room, I went to him and said, I am afraid there is a design against the lives of the Mr. Smith. Will you go immediately and bring your captain, and if not convenient, any other captain of a company, and I will pay you well for your trouble? He said he would, and departed forthwith, and soon returned with his captain, whose name I have forgotten, and introduced him to me. I told him of my fears and requested him immediately to fetch his company. He departed forthwith and arrived at the door with them, just at the time that the constable was hurrying the brethren downstairs. A number of brethren went along, and 1 or 2 strangers, and all of us, safely lodged in the prison, remained there during the night." End quote. So, all of John Taylor's arguments against Governor Ford, everything that George A. Smith put in the history of the church about how unlawful this arrest was, is immediately nullified by the following paragraphs. Quote, "As Esquire Woods," that's Joe's counsel, "went to the door, he met Captain Dunn with some 20 men, they having come to guard the prisoners to jail. Mr. Woods accompanied Governor Ford to Captain Justice Robert F. Smith, who gave as a cause for issuing the warrant of committal that the prisoners were not personally safe at the hotel. Mr. Woods then requested the governor to have a company of troops from some other county detailed to guard the jail." End quote. Yeah, the reason that they were taken to Carthage Jail was just as much for their own protection as it was to prevent them from fleeing Carthage under the cover of night. They even got their own security detail at the direction of Governor Ford, who would select only the most trusted of soldiers to make sure that vigilante justice wasn't served while Jo and Hyrum were there. They couldn't be kept safe at Hamilton's hotel because it was bursting at the seams, full of people who wanted Joseph and Hyrum dead. They were brought to Carthage Jail for their own protection. So the company began their journey from Hamilton's hotel to Carthage Jail. Quote, "Captain Dunn with his company escorted Joseph and Hyrum Smith from their lodgings, together with Willard Richards, John Taylor, John P. Green, Stephen Markham, Dan Jones, John S. Fulmer, Dr. Southwick, and Lorenzo D. Watson to the jail. Markham had a very large hickory cane, which he called the rascal beater. Dan Jones had a smaller walking stick, and they walked on either side of Joseph and Hyrum, keeping off the drunken rabble, who several times broke through the ranks." End quote. So, Joseph Smith, Hyrum Smith, Nauvoo City Marshal John P. Green, Dan Jones, a Danite who ran a ferry on the Mississippi, John S. Fulmer, what's up, Gazela? Dr. Southwick is a Nauvoo city councilor, and Lorenzo D. Watson, another city councilman. They were all locked up in Carthage Jail on the night of Tuesday, June 25th, 1844. Initially, they were placed in the dungeon, but as the quarters were too constrictive for all of these men together, they were moved upstairs to the debtor's apartment, quote, "where the prisoners and their friends had amusing conversations on various interesting subjects which engaged them till late." End quote. And of course, they had a good old-fashioned Kirtland-era style prayer meeting in the cell that night. Quote, "Prayer was offered, which made Carthage prison into the gate of heaven for a while. They laid promiscuously, all right, on the floor, where they all slept from 11:30 until 6 a.m. of the 26th. End quote. One of these men wouldn't leave that jail cell alive. One of these men would leave the jail cell by falling out of a window, only to be repeatedly shot upon his crumbling to the ground 2 stories below. One of these men would leave the jail cell on a stretcher filled with bullet holes and missing a massive chunk of flesh from his hip. Yet another would leave the jail cell only having sustained a small graze on the ear from another bullet. The rest would leave long before that fateful 2 minutes of Mormon history. The overall point remains that nobody left Carthage Jail unscathed in one way or another. In less than 48 hours, Mormonism would be tossed into the depths of chaos and uncertainty, having just lost their prophet and patriarch. That's going to do it for our episode today. Have a couple of announcements to get through real quick. We have Sunstone Symposium coming up. That's going to be coming up this year, July 29th to August 1st, 2020. It is a completely virtual symposium, the first ever virtual Sunstone that has ever been held, obviously because of recent events. So if that's something that interests you, we're going to be doing it over the Whova app. If you are interested in attending Sunstone this year, you can do it from your phone or from your couch, from your computer, from wherever. You don't have to travel to Salt Lake City like we have had, for the past ever that Sunstone has been going on. So if you want information on that, check out sunstonemagazine.com or check in the show notes for a link to sunstonemagazine.com where you can find all the information necessary for the 2020 symposium. Also, we have a live Q&A coming up on June 8th at 6 p.m. There is a Q&A thread in the Patreon exclusive feed, the patreon.com/Naked Mormonism. If you have questions, or comments, thoughts, anything that you want to have discussed, be sure to pop a comment there on the Patreon exclusive thread if you are a patron. Of course, we give, preference to any questions that come from patrons. I also, we recently finished the Namo Book Club reading through Manuscript Story Conneaut Creek. That's the Spalding manuscript that historians have that is extant to this day. And there are, some general concluding thoughts and whatnot that I did on the concluding episode for that Namo Book Club installment. So if you have any questions about the Spalding theory or about, the Manuscript Story Conneaut Creek itself, I'd be happy to answer those questions there. However, because of current events, when this podcast is coming out on June 4th, 2020, if we don't get very many questions, I'm just going to take a bit of time to talk about racism in the church, because that's a prescient discussion that needs to happen. So if you want to tune in for that, check the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel. We're going to be doing a live broadcast. Once again, that's going to be happening June 8th, 2020, beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific time. All right, so we do also have some listener mail to get to. So this email came in from S, and this listener mail segment is going to probably qualify as a bit of a Bryce was wrong segment. So S sent in this email. I'm not sure if I have their permission to use their name, so I'm going to just say S. S says, I was listening to your episode 198, Higbee Descent. At about 40 minutes into the podcast, you claimed that Higbee was given recognizance to appear before the High Council from the Nauvoo court if he wanted to get out of a $100 fine that would obviously mix church and state. Then they said, I found this recognizance below, and that doesn't appear to be the fact. Is there another one, or am I missing something? If it is true, I would like the documentation for my files. And then S provides the link to the Joseph Smith papers for that recognizance of May 24th, 1842. So in looking at the script for episode 198, Higbee Descent, I did come across where I said that, and I just said coming out of this entire affair was the Nauvoo Municipal Court hearing. And the recognizance actually was not, I'm not sure what document I was using or how I came to that conclusion when I was actually putting the script together for episode 198, but the recognizance file that S sent over to me indeed is the one that looks like I was using for the show notes, and it does not say what I said that it stated in the podcast. So that was where I was mistaken. It does not actually require Higbee to appear before the church, the High Council, it requires him to appear before the Nauvoo Municipal Circuit Court, actually. If I'm reading the recognizance correctly, it says, let me just read it right here. The condition of the recognizance is such that if the above-bound Chauncey L. Higbee shall personally be appear and before the circuit court on the first day of the term thereof next to be holden in and for the county aforesaid, then and there to answer a charge of slander and defamation against the character of Joseph Smith and abide the judgment of the court and not depart without leave, then the recognizance shall be void. Otherwise it shall be and remain in full force and virtue of law. So that recognizance does say that he has to appear before the circuit court, which would be the circuit court at Carthage, not necessarily the Nauvoo circuit court, because Nauvoo was a municipal, not circuit court. So anyway, that does say he's got to appear before the circuit court instead of the High Council. As I stated in the episode, I just simply made a mistake. I read the document wrong and I came to my own conclusion, and that conclusion was wrong. So thank you so much to S for keeping me clear on that. I do also want to say the slander and defamation that Joseph Smith initially filed against Chauncey Higbee for this, Chauncey and Francis Higbee, was for slander and defamation. The slander and defamation was based on the practice of polygamy. Joseph Smith teaching polygamy. Chauncey Higbee stated to many women, apparently, that it was okay to practice polygamy as taught by Joseph Smith, and Joe filed the lawsuit of slander against Chauncey Higbee for it. So while those are essentially ecclesiastical affairs that may run the gamut of, teaching the practice of polygamy as doctrine, as the theology of the church, that does kind of dance the line of church and state. That infraction of slander may dance that line, the actual municipal court versus the circuit court versus the High Council does not dance the line. So, S, thank you so much for keeping me intellectually honest in that. Next email that I have to be intellectually honest about, this comes in from Dennis. And this actually comes as a result of the patron exclusive segment of last week's episode. I talked about evolution and the church's stance on evolution. And I said lately the church has been softening its stance on evolution. And, I wasn't entirely correct. I think I said particularly that the church has become more friendly towards the teaching of evolution. Well, Dennis wrote in an email that the church is basically is teaching a system of creationism, and this sent me down a long rabbit hole. And Dennis also provided a few quotes from Russell M. Nelson and Gordon B. Hinckley that men was created in the image of God. So I had to go looking where the church has, official statements about evolution. The church now has its own 2016 article about the church's beliefs in evolution, and it cites back to an article from the presidency from 1909. From 1909 about a definitive statement that evolution is not true. But then it says in the top of this article from 2016, the church has no official position on the theory of evolution. It goes on to say organic evolution or changes to species' inherited traits over time is a matter for scientific study. Nothing has been revealed concerning evolution. So I don't know if it's typical, or if that you can consider that a softening of the stance towards evolution, of going from evolution is not true, God or men are made in the image of God, to saying we have no official position on evolution, and then reiterating the point that men are made in the image of God. I don't know if that's considered actually being more friendly towards or softening their stance on evolution, but it very much appears that Dennis is accurate and that I misspoke a little bit in the patron exclusive segment. So to Dennis as well as to S, thanks for keeping me honest and making it so I have to issue corrections on the show from time to time when I do make a mistake. So thank you to both of you. And that's going to do it for our episode tonight. Thank you all listeners so much for tuning in. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing. It really means a lot to me. Thanks for giving me your ear. Hope to talk to you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.
Never
This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the Law Offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.